I, 28M, need to get this off my chest. My story starts when I was 8 years old. My mom passed away from a brain aneurysm, leaving just me and my dad Martin, 56M. Those first few years were tough. Dad worked as a construction supervisor and had to juggle his job with raising me alone. When I was 12, he met Janet, 49F, at a friend's barbecue. She had a daughter, Candace, 26F, who was 10 at the time. Dad and Janet dated for a year before getting married. At first, everything seemed perfect. Janet was really sweet to me, always making sure I felt included. She'd cook my favorite meals, help me with homework, and treat me just like she treated Candace. She even insisted I call her mom, though I wasn't comfortable with that and stuck with Janet. Candace and I got along well too. She started calling me big brother within months, and I actually enjoyed having a little sister. Growing up, our family seemed close on the surface. Dad worked hard to provide for all of us, often taking extra shifts to make sure we had everything we needed. Janet never worked, saying she needed to stay home to take care of the house and us kids, even after we were teenagers. Looking back, I realized she just enjoyed living off Dad's income. After college, I got a job at an IT company and stayed living at home. I wanted to save money, but I also worried about Dad. His job was physically demanding, and I could see it taking a toll on him. I started contributing to household expenses even though Dad insisted I didn't need to. I paid for groceries, utilities, and even helped with the mortgage sometimes. Candace also lived at home, but her approach was different. She worked part-time at a high-end nail salon, but every penny she earned went to designer clothes, weekend parties, and her expensive beauty treatments. Janet always defended her, saying Candace was young and should enjoy life. Meanwhile, I was paying bills while Candace spent $500 on a purse. The real change came last year when Dad started coughing badly and losing weight. I pushed him to see a doctor, but Janet and Candace said I was overreacting. When he finally went, the diagnosis hit us like a truck: stage 4 lung cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months at most. Those 6 months were the hardest of my life. I took extended leave from work to care for Dad. I drove him to every chemo appointment, managed his medications, and spent nights by his hospital bed. Janet and Candace barely helped. Janet claimed she was too emotionally fragile to handle seeing him sick. Candace was always too busy with her friends or too tired from her part-time job. They'd show up at the hospital for an hour, take some pictures for social media about being there for family, then leave. Dad's medical bills were massive. Insurance covered some, but there was still a lot to pay. I emptied my savings and even took a loan to help cover the costs. When I asked Janet and Candace to contribute, Janet said they were saving their money for emergencies. I later found out their emergencies meant Candace's spa treatments and Janet's shopping trips. Dad fought hard, but the cancer was aggressive. He passed away 3 months ago in his sleep. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Janet and Candace were at a restaurant, saying they needed to clear their heads. The day after Dad's funeral, everything changed. Janet asked me to come to the living room for a talk. Candace was there too, looking smug. Janet's sweet stepmom act disappeared completely. She told me that since Dad was gone, there was no reason for me to stay with them anymore. According to her, they needed to move on and having me around would make that harder. I was shocked. I reminded her that I'd been paying bills and helping with expenses for years. Janet laughed and said that meant nothing now that Dad was gone. She said she needed to focus on her real family, meaning her and Candace. When I pointed out that they'd called me son and brother for 16 years, Candace snorted and said that was just to make Dad happy. I tried reasoning with them. The house had been my home for most of my life. I had nowhere else to go, having spent my savings on Dad's treatment. Janet's response was to threaten calling the cops if I didn't leave by the next day. She said she'd tell them I was harassing them and refusing to leave their house. I spent that night in my room, looking at old family photos and wondering if any of it had ever been real. The next morning, I packed whatever I could fit in my car. As I was leaving, Candace stood in the doorway, smirking and waving goodbye like she was enjoying the show. My friend Carl let me crash on his couch while I figured things out. I was struggling financially. The loan payments for Dad's medical bills were eating up most of my salary. Finding an apartment was hard with my credit hit by the medical loans, but Carl helped me deal with landlords and eventually co-signed a lease for me. I went completely no contact with Janet and Candace, blocking them everywhere. I focused on work, got a promotion, and slowly started rebuilding my savings. Carl helped me through the worst days when the betrayal felt fresh and raw. I thought that chapter of my life was over. But last week, something happened that changed everything. Ida, for what I did next? Update 1 first, I want to thank everyone for their supportive comments on my last post. Reading your responses helped me realize I wasn't overreacting about Janet and Candace's behavior. A lot has happened in the past 2 weeks, and I need to share it. I was at work last Tuesday, focused on a major software project, when my team lead told me someone was asking for me at reception. I figured it was a delivery or something work-related. Instead, I found Candace standing there, looking nothing like her usual self. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. She was wearing plain jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her expensive manicure was chipped, and she wasn't wearing her usual full face of makeup. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. When she saw me, she burst into tears. Not her usual dramatic crying that she used to do to get Dad to buy her things, but real, messy sobbing. Several of my coworkers were staring, so I took her to the break room to avoid making a scene. She kept apologizing and saying she and Janet needed to talk to me urgently. At first, I refused. I had no interest in getting pulled back into their drama. But Candace kept begging, saying they'd made a terrible mistake and needed to make things right. She looked so desperate that my curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop after work, mainly because I wanted to know what could make Candace, who'd smirked while watching me pack my things, act this way. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Janet and Candace were already there. Janet looked as different as Candace did. She'd lost weight, had dark circles under her eyes, and was wearing clothes I recognized from years ago instead of her usual expensive outfits. They'd gotten a table in the corner, away from other customers. Janet started crying the moment I sat down. She launched into this long, dramatic speech about how sorry they were and how they'd made a horrible mistake. She said they missed me and wanted me to come back home. Candace kept nodding along, adding comments about how empty the house felt without me and how much they regretted their actions. I sat there silently, watching this performance. It was the same technique they'd used on Dad whenever they wanted something: tears, guilt, and emotional manipulation. I'd seen this show too many times to fall for it. When Janet finally ran out of tears, I asked them what they really wanted. They exchanged nervous looks before Janet admitted the truth. They were drowning in debt. Apparently, Janet had been taking out loans for years without telling Dad. She'd used multiple credit cards and even taken cash advances, all while Dad was working overtime to provide for us. The money went to maintaining their lifestyle, Candace's shopping sprees, Janet's luxury spa memberships, expensive restaurants, and designer everything. When Dad was sick, they hadn't helped with medical bills because they were already struggling to make minimum payments on their credit cards. After his death, things got worse. Without my contribution to household expenses and with their spending habits unchanged, they'd fallen behind on payments. Now creditors were calling constantly, threatening legal action. Janet asked if I could move back and help pay their debts since I had a good job and had gotten a promotion. She had the nerve to say it was the least I could do for family. That's when I laughed. The same people who'd thrown me out saying I wasn't family now wanted me to bail them out. Candace tried to convince me, saying they'd learned their lesson and things would be different this time. Then she accidentally let something slip. They were planning to sell the house to pay off their debts. They thought that by selling Dad's house, which they assumed was now Janet's, they could clear their debts and start fresh. I left the coffee shop immediately and called Dad's lawyer, Mr. Thompson. What he told me changed everything. Dad had transferred the house to my name 2 weeks before he died. He'd done it quietly, not telling Janet or Candace. Mr. Thompson said Dad had been concerned about their spending habits and wanted to make sure I'd have security after he was gone. The irony of the situation hit me hard. Janet and Candace had kicked me out of my own house. They'd been living in property that legally belonged to me while plotting to sell it. Dad had seen through their act and protected me one last time. I sat in my car for a long time after that call, looking at the coffee shop where Janet and Candace were probably still sitting, planning how to manipulate me into helping them. But this time, I had more than just hurt feelings. I had the power to do something about their betrayal. I'm planning my next move carefully. They don't know yet that the house is mine. Ida, if I use this information to teach them a lesson about karma? Update 2. Thanks for all your support and suggestions on my last post. You were right, they needed to face consequences for their actions. Here's what happened in the past month. After discovering the house was legally mine, I met with my lawyer to discuss my options. He confirmed that Dad had made sure everything was properly documented. The house transfer was completely legal, and Dad had even included a letter explaining his reasons. He wrote that he'd noticed Janet and Candace's excessive spending and worried they'd try to sell the house after his death instead of letting me live there. My lawyer helped me prepare an official eviction notice. We sent it via certified mail so they couldn't claim they never received it. The notice gave them 30 days to vacate the property, as required by law. 3 days after they received the notice, Janet started leaving desperate voicemails. She was crying, saying there must be some mistake. When I didn't respond, she and Candace showed up at my apartment. Candace started yelling in the hallway about how I was trying to make them homeless. My neighbors called the building security, and they were escorted out. They tried fighting the eviction in court. Janet claimed she had rights to the house as Dad's widow, but my lawyer presented their prenuptial agreement. Dad had made sure to protect his assets, including the house, before marrying Janet. The judge ruled in my favor, maintaining the 30-day eviction period. Janet and Candace's true colors really showed during the court hearing. Janet tried painting me as an ungrateful stepson who was betraying his father's memory. But when the judge asked about them kicking me out after Dad's death, they couldn't explain their actions. Candace actually said they were emotionally distraught and weren't thinking clearly. The judge didn't buy it. After losing in court, they started reaching out to family friends for help. They spread stories about how I was cruelly throwing them out of their home. But these friends had seen how they treated me during Dad's illness, how they barely helped with his care or medical bills. No one was willing to take their side. Candace's boyfriend, who she'd been living with part-time, dumped her when he learned about their debt situation. Apparently, she'd been using his credit card for shopping without his knowledge. Janet's sister, who we used to visit during holidays, refused to take them in. She told me later that she'd warned Janet about her spending habits for years, but Janet never listened. Yesterday was eviction day. I arrived with my lawyer and a police officer, expecting drama. The house was a mess. They'd clearly stopped taking care of it after Dad died. The garden Dad loved was overgrown, there were water stains on the ceiling from a leak they'd ignored, and the garage was filled with shopping bags and boxes of new clothes, many with tags still attached. While they packed, I found stacks of unopened letters in Dad's office. There were medical bills they'd ignored, collection notices from credit card companies, and even a notice about a lien on Janet's car. They'd been living in denial, hoping I'd come back and fix their problems like I always had before. Janet made one last attempt to stay, offering to pay rent. But given their financial situation and past behavior, I refused. They finally left with just their personal belongings, Janet crying and Candace glaring at me like I was the villain in their story. After they left, Carl helped me walk through the house. We found more evidence of their careless lifestyle, expensive perfumes in the bathroom, designer shoes stuffed in closets, high-end makeup scattered everywhere. Meanwhile, Dad's things, his favorite chair, his books, his tools, had been shoved into the garage like trash. I'm now living in Dad's house again. The place needs a lot of work, but it feels right being here. Janet and Candace are staying at a motel while supposedly looking for an apartment, though their credit and debt situation will make that difficult. They're still trying to contact me through mutual friends, switching between begging for another chance and accusing me of ruining their lives. But I'm done feeling guilty about their problems. They made their choices, and now they're facing the consequences. Dad protected me one last time by making sure I'd have the house, and I won't let his final act of love go to waste. Update 3: Many people have been messaging me asking for another update, so here's what's happened in the last 6 months. After Janet and Candace left, I took a week off work to start fixing up the house. The damage from their neglect was worse than I initially thought. The roof leaked in 3 places, the kitchen sink had a major plumbing issue they'd ignored, and the hardwood floors Dad had installed himself were warped from water damage. Carl helped me interview contractors and get estimates. The repairs cost a significant chunk of my savings, but it was worth it. Dad had always taken such pride in this house, spending weekends maintaining it and working on small improvement projects. I couldn't let it fall apart after he worked so hard to keep it nice. The garden was my biggest project. Dad loved his garden, it was his escape after long days at construction sites. Janet and Candace had let it die, not even bothering to water the plants he'd carefully tended for years. I spent weekends clearing overgrown weeds, replanting his favorite flowers, and fixing the small pond he'd built. Carl's mom, who's an avid gardener, helped me salvage some of Dad's old plants and taught me how to care for them. Janet and Candace eventually moved to another state to live with Janet's elderly mother. Before they left, they tried one last manipulation attempt. Janet sent a mutual friend to tell me that she was sick and needed money for treatment. I asked for proof of her medical condition, and suddenly the story changed, she was miraculously better. They still try reaching out occasionally. They create new social media accounts to message me or get someone else to call on their behalf. Last month, Candace even sent a lengthy email claiming she'd found God and wanted to make amends. The email ended with a request to borrow money for a fresh start. Last week, while cleaning the attic, I found a box of Dad's old photos and documents. Inside was a letter addressed to me, dated a week before he died. He wrote that he'd noticed Janet and Candace's true nature years ago but stayed with Janet because he thought having a mother figure in my life was important. He apologized for not seeing sooner how they took advantage of my kindness. Dad also explained why he put the house in my name. He wrote that he'd overheard Janet and Candace discussing plans to sell the house after his death. They'd already been talking to realtors while he was sick. That's when he quietly transferred the property to me, ensuring I'd always have a home. The house feels like home again now. I kept Dad's furniture and photos but repainted the walls in colors he'd always wanted to try. His tool shed is exactly as he left it. I use his tools whenever I work on house projects, and it feels like he's still teaching me how to fix things. Carl still comes over often, and we've started a tradition of Sunday barbecues in the backyard, just like Dad used to do. Sometimes when I'm working in the garden or fixing something around the house, I feel Dad's presence, and I know he'd be proud that I'm taking care of his legacy. I've learned that family isn't about who claims the title, it's about who stands by you when things are tough. Carl has been more family to me than Janet and Candace ever were. Dad knew that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and his final act of putting the house in my name protected me from people who only pretended to care. This will be my final update. I'm at peace with everything now, and it's time to close this chapter completely.